Welcome to the last part of our basic income conference. I hope that you've all been enjoying the speakers, and this last part then is focusing upon the Nova Scotia context and various considerations that we need to be thinking about in implementing a basic income. So the moderator of the panel is Sarah Murphy, and she is going to be introducing the order of the panelists. Each panelist has been asked to talk for approximately 5 minutes, but no longer than 10 minutes. At 10 minutes, they're going to get cut off. Yeah, that's right. We'll be brutal. And if you could allow all of the speakers to finish their presentations before we ask questions, I would appreciate that. So at the end of all of the speakers' presentations, we will have a Q&A that hopefully can last a considerable period of time. So thank you. Sarah.
Thanks, Mandy. So again, my name is Sarah, and I'll be moderating this portion of today's conference. So we have 7 panelists with us today, and as Mandy explained, each panelist will have 7 minutes. Just as a heads up to the panelists, we have Nathan sitting at the front, and he'll be giving a 2-minute and 1-minute warning just as a helpful tool to keep us on track today. So I'll begin by introducing Roger Hunka. Roger is the Director of Intergovernmental Affairs for the Maritime Aboriginal Peoples Council. He has over 35 years of administrative experiences, including 10 years as an adult trainer and educator. Roger has been directly involved as a founder and/or partner party to several not-for-profit, charitable, and for-profit entities. The majority of these have been to accommodate and advance the social, cultural, educational, economic, and political aspirations and needs of Aboriginal peoples. Roger has served as the National Bilateral Relations Director for the Conference of Aboriginal Peoples, the Director of Intergovernmental Affairs for the Maritime Aboriginal Peoples Council, and the Director for the Maritime Aboriginal Aquatic Resources Secretariat, producer for the Mi'kma'ki, the MAP, Mi'kmaq Language Learning Services, Micmac Business Finder, and SEDCO Small Business Learning Series. Roger has also served as Executive Director of the Native Council of Nova Scotia, President of the Mi'kmaq Development Corporation, as well as serving as Director on the boards of several charities and not-for-profit entities, and Advisor on Indigenous Rights Development. Roger has staunchly spoken and worked for the elimination of social, cultural, economic, political, and environmental policies and abuses which demean the merit, worth, and capacity of the person, the health of Mother Earth, and compromise the present and future harmony of humankind. Please welcome Roger.
And could each speaker talk directly into the mic when they're presenting? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I have, 3 minutes left. It's pretty hard to put 500 years in a short period of time, but I think I'll have to do that just to put it in context where I'm coming from and the presentation itself on that question, which is a really heavy question to answer. Following on what Vince had been his presentation, when we talk about human rights, and obviously we have to realize that, let's go back to the Charter, the Atlantic Charter. We had, during a very, very tumultuous time in our history, and continuing where people kill each other because of ideologies and beliefs, we had Mr. Stalin, Mr. Roosevelt, and Mr. Churchill back in the 40s, late 40s, determined that there is something wrong. We've always had poverty, and we've always had the rich, and we've always had the poor, and it will continue. But why does it culminate in crisis and bloodshed? The Charter, the preamble to the International Human Rights, the Bill of Human Rights is very important. The preamble is important. People tend to forget that, but the preamble was couched in a very interesting language. It talked about security of the person, but also freedom from want. Freedom from want was excluded in our development of our Constitution for a very specific reason, and it talked about right, but not right to what? Freedom from want basically was developed to say that if your needs, your aspirations, your worth as a human being, your merit, your capacity, in other words, your human dignity, if that's not allowed freedom to flourish, then you will uprise. Then you will turn to all forms of insurrection, violence, or whatever. So if we could address the freedom from want, then maybe we'll do something. Maybe it could move ahead. The Declaration itself does not talk about freedom from want, but the preamble does. The issue with Aboriginal peoples in Canada is a long and sorry history. These lands, you must remember, have been occupied by the Indigenous peoples of what we call Turtle Island. The Indigenous communities, the Aboriginal peoples, Native peoples, whatever term you want to use, there are many, many nations. In this part of North, what we call Canada, now Ganada, which by the way is an Iroquois word meaning place there, was occupied by well over 100 different nations. We have today nested within this federation of Ganada 73 nations remaining. Those nations of peoples had and developed relationships with the French, well, with the Norse peoples, then with the French, lived carefully in the Mi'kmaq land here, lived with the French for 175 years, and then with the English through treaty relationships, and continue to this day. However, the policy, the colonial policy of the English was to acculturate, to bring people to become the gentry, somehow to civilize the Indian, to wean them from the nomadic lifestyle of in the woods, to spare him the outrages or the unscrupulous settlers' activities, and to Christianize them. However, the English forgot that the Mi'kmaq were Christianized and adopted the Catholic faith in 1610. Mi'kmaq, all the Aboriginal peoples through the colonial acts have really a sorry, sad history. Basically, the colonial purpose was to disaggregate, break up nations. Today we have 633 Indian Act bands throughout this country. We have over 3,000 reserves, anywhere from a little room to a few hundred acres. The disaggregation has been real. We have, to this date, an Indian Act that has not changed from its original purpose. It's one of the very few pieces of legislation in Canadian history that has kept its goal consistent since Confederation, to get rid of the Indian problem in Canada. And that, unfortunately, has led to all kinds of atrocities. And even lately, we had the announcement by the previous premier or prime minister of this country that we're sorry the apology basically stated, we are sorry for trying to kill the Indian in the Indian child. Pretty rough words, but that's exactly what's been happening and did happen. We've had a disaggregation which has left Aboriginal peoples throughout this country living on reserves, and Aboriginal peoples continuing on their traditional ancestral homelands. The homelands of the Mi'kmaq are quite large. They encompass all of Nova Scotia, all of Prince Edward Island, the Bay of Fundy, all the way up the Northumberland Strait, up to the Bay de Chaleur along the Gaspé. So it's a very large coastal nation of peoples. People living on the reserve have had some support from the federal government in a way of promises that were made that, we will take care of you. The Great White Father will take care of you, don't worry. However, we'll hear later on that taking care of has not been that great. The off-reserve have been totally ignored. As a federation, you must realize that we have the provinces which were colonies gave up powers. We didn't have such a thing as a Canada. They gave up powers to create a Canada. We wanted to create a federal government for many, many reasons. One, obviously, is always about the Americans and to the south. But we created by giving up certain powers. And, of course, those are known as 91 powers. And the rest, the 92 powers, were retained by what we now have the provinces. Many of the 92 powers are the social powers, the powers for hospitals, the powers for education, the powers for asylums, the powers for a range of opening businesses, taverns, and so forth, etc. The federal powers restricted to army, lighthouses, coinage, and so forth and so forth. Indians fall under a federal responsibility known as the 9124, where the federal government has the responsibility for the Aboriginal Indian peoples. I use the term Indian because the Indian Act is the one that creates the Indian. Today we have well over 1 million Aboriginal peoples in Canada, registered about the same number, more to be registered. The Indian Act keeps evolving as the courts determine it to be in violation of fundamental human rights as well as rights under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So we are constantly creating more and more Indians, or what I call the paper Indian. The problem with that is that we have persons who live off reserve have to make their own way in life, have to, even though you're Indian, you have promises, you have treaty rights. The federal government maintains that the only Indian that is an Indian is the one that lives on a reserve, and that comes out every once in a while and does something at the Calgary Stampede or whatever it is, and a few powwows, and that's an Indian. It doesn't recognize the person, the very person, as a Mi'kmaq person, as a Cree, as an Ojibwe, as a Saulteaux, as an Innu, all 73 nations. We don't want to recognize that reality, but that is the reality. They're a person. They belong to a nation. They have a history, have a language, have a culture, and everything else. So we have off-reserve. The off-reserve have constantly been marginalized by the Department of Aboriginal Affairs and by governments themselves at the federal level and the provincial level. Because of sort of the back and forth, an Aboriginal person in need.
Pardon me, Roger.
Pardon me?
If you could,
I have 2 more minutes?
conclude in 30 seconds, please.
30 seconds? All right, 30 seconds.
I hate this job.
Okay, 30 seconds. As I said, 30 seconds. The Supreme Court of Canada in what decade were we in 1917, issued a declaration on what does Indian mean in 9124. And it determined that Indian includes the non-status and Métis person as a 9124 Indian. That battle was going on for many, many years. Finally, the Supreme Court said, yes, you are Indian. However, they're not treated as Indians. They're left on their own. Because they're left on their own, obviously they've formed organizations to fight for their rights and fight for inclusion and recognition. The issue of how the question is how can basic income work for Indigenous people and families living on and off reserve? There would be differences, obviously. There would be differences in how you deliver it. And one thing to remember, poverty, when you're poor, or you don't have, or you're in need, or there's a want that you need and have, you will gravitate to who or what satisfies that want. Unfortunately, in a country such as rich like Canada, we shouldn't have poverty at all. We shouldn't have carried over this old feudal system of poverty. Some people say to me they'd love to live in the old days of the Egyptians, where at least it was rough, you were a slave, but you were guaranteed something as a slave. You were guaranteed your loaf of bread, you were guaranteed work, obviously slaving away on the pyramids, whatever it was. You were guaranteed a shelter, a little cave. those three things were guaranteed. Plus you had 2 quarts of beer. I mean...
Thank you, Roger.
So that right now we don't have any beer anytime, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roger. 7 minutes is not a long enough time to go through a complex history. So our next speaker is Pierre Stephens. Pierre recently retired from Dalhousie University, where he taught for 35 years in the Department of Mathematics and Statistics. He was active in the Dalhousie Faculty Association, serving on the executive and negotiation team. Pierre grew up in the Netherlands, where he benefited from government-funded post-secondary education. Pierre is currently a treasurer of both Basic Income Canada Network and Basic Income Guarantee Nova Scotia. Pierre is guided by his belief that every human being has the right to a fair standard of living, and that as a society, we have an obligation to make this possible for all. Please welcome Pierre.
I do need my slides, sorry. So the question was, how can we finance a basic income in Nova Scotia? And the answer is not the way they are doing it right now. So, and what the culture at the moment is really something that has come from 400 years of a so-called welfare state, which has propagated the myth that you have to keep people in poverty because there is not enough money. And that is still the attitude that the Nova Scotia government takes. So we are fighting a myth, and that there's not enough money. And I want to counter that with the evidence. Now, fortunately, that has already been done today, but I want to also sort of point out something else in terms of a basic income. A basic income you can also see as an investment into Canada. You can also see it as an insurance, say, against times that could be bad for you and so on. And I want to compare it with healthcare, and say like, healthcare, when it had to be implemented, had the same problems as basic income. How do you finance it? And basically they said, well, you can do it at provincial and federal level. You can do it so personal taxes and corporate income taxes. And you can add things to it, say sales taxes, lotteries, casinos. And some provinces have health premiums and so on. So there are creative ways that you can create income, that you can create revenue as a government if you want to. Now, I was going to come up with the evidence, but I think that has been done quite well already today. We have the Parliamentary Budget Office, which came up with a cost number, and analysis of that cost number basically shows that it is the bottom line. It is possible that we can pay for that cost part. And even if we couldn't, what if we're short? Well, let's have a look at the healthcare system. There are always ways in which, in a grand plan, we could raise extra money, extra revenues for our basic income. We could fiddle around with the marginal tax rates. We could fiddle around with the corporate tax rates. And by the way, this is nothing revolutionary. Look at the corporate tax rates. They have fiddled around with it since 1986, and it has gone from 38% in 1986 to 15% now. So you can imagine why, remember Vince Calderhead's slides about the income assistance flat, or actually maybe even decreasing. We have GST, HST sort of revenues, and you can go through them. You can be as creative as if you want. But I think it's not even needed, because if we look at other studies that have been done, and I'm not just flipping through them and go to the fourth one or whatever, the last couple of years, the studies all show that you can have a revenue-neutral system that pays for a basic income. Now, high income earners will lose a little bit, and of course low income earners will be benefiting. So there is a Stimson-Stevens, there is Courtney Coble's paper that she contributed to, and also we have now coming up, probably will be published in June, Basic Income Canada is doing what they call policy options. working out what 3 or 4 different forms of a basic income could cost so that if politicians want to jump on the bandwagon, they have something to work with. Now, what has happened in Nova Scotia? What evidence is there in Nova Scotia about a basic income? Well, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, depending on how you look at it, the Nova Scotia Department of Community Services did a so-called analysis of what a basic income would cost in Nova Scotia, and they came up with the bottom conclusion, and that is, it is too expensive, and we're not even going to think about it. We're going to continue with the income assistance program. Okay? Now, unfortunately, the reality is, we should keep the Nova Scotia government accountable to it. That study was totally flawed. It was limited in scope. It is flawed in terms of what kind of a basic income design that they were considering, and it also was assuming that Nova Scotia was responsible for a basic income all on its own, which is totally not where the evidence is going now. It's a joint federal-provincial responsibility, just like healthcare. So the evidence actually is there that it's quite feasible to have a basic income in Nova Scotia. What that does raise is a very simple question. Say, why does the Nova Scotia government insist on continuing with the income assistance program, which keeps people systematically in poverty? My answer is 400 years of welfare state culture, and that's a myth that we have to break, And my question, coming from Basic Income Nova Scotia, is why don't we do a decent feasibility study like some of the academic papers that we see and get the answer to this once and for all? Not just a, shall we say, Department of Community Services kind of study, but a multi-party study with economists, socialists on it, etc. To me, for Nova Scotia, for the politicians, it all boils down to a very simple question, and that is, do we want to implement a basic income, or do we prefer to keep people living in poverty? That to me is sort of like what this all comes down to. If you want to continue 400 years of keeping people in poverty, that's what you're doing. If you want to change it, the evidence is there that where there is a will, there will be a way to do it. Let me give you another consideration. I picked here, just as an example to illustrate, I picked the county of Yarmouth. There's 15,000 people in the age group of 18 to 64 with a poverty rate of 30%. And on average, they live 20 to 60% below the LICO, or maybe the basket, whatever that kind of measure is. If we gave these people a basic income, that would give the county of Yarmouth between $18 and $54 million a year that goes into their local economy. That's money that gets spent on food, on clothing, on shelter. That is money that goes into the economy. So the question is, why is Yarmouth County not screaming for a basic income? And I wish that Way was still here, because he is president of the Nova Scotia, Association of Municipalities. He could sort of probably wonder, why are not all municipalities screaming and yelling about this? So really the question is, why isn't everybody in Nova Scotia knocking on their MLA's door and say, give us a basic income? Because it is good for our economy. It is good. Oh, really last thought. Let's stop looking at people in poverty as a drag on the economy. That's what 400 years of poverty culture has done. Let's start looking at these people, 42,000 people in Nova Scotia, as the turbocharged engine for the Nova Scotia economy. Because if they are spending their money in Nova Scotia, each and every community will benefit of it, and therefore we all will benefit of it. Thank you. That's how you finance a basic income in Nova Scotia.
Thanks, Pierre. Our next panelist is Amy Moonshadow. Amy Moonshadow is a political activist a starving artist, and she is a survivor. She has overcome the stigma associated with the invisible disability of an acquired brain injury. Appearances can be deceiving. Nothing wrong with her intellect. A determination to live in an equitable society has provided Amy with the opportunity to work grants and unpaid as a community health advocate for the Health Authority, at Dal Nursing School, and numerous non-government organizations promoting self-determination for folks in disadvantaged situations. As a nominee for Provincial Riding Association 3 elections ago, Amy made it to the second ballot. Her end goal is a social policy that ends legislated poverty. Please welcome Amy.
Hi. I had no intention of living in poverty, but the traumatic brain injury put my secure employability options out of reach. Now, a basic income would afford me the luxury of living like a human being with full citizenship, choosing within reason what I eat, where I live, and how I entertain myself. I have been an activist for a long time and with an artistic bent that I'd like to pursue in more depth. A guaranteed annual income would free my time up from being more involved in social justice works using art for activism. Having more than just enough, not having to question every budget item that I spend on my basic needs right now, is a dream. A livable income for myself would take the stress away of the worrying about the adult onset diabetes in my family and break the cycle that has been my heritage for the last 3, maybe 4 generations that I'm aware of. I imagine and have dreams of going to a gym for strength and endurance physical fitness if this deficit income that I survive on now was not an issue. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. Our next panelist is Karen Foster. For those of you who were here last year, Karen was one of our keynote speakers. Karen Foster is an associate professor at Dalhousie in the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology. She holds the Canada Research Chair in Sustainable Rural Futures for Atlantic Canada and is director of the Rural Futures Research Centre. Her research includes studies of work and income in Atlantic Canada, generations and work, and precarious employment and inequality. Welcome, Karen.
So like everyone else, I only have a few minutes, so I'm going to cut right to what I think is one of the most important things about a basic income guarantee, and then I'll tell you why it's particularly salient in rural communities. So, great. Should I be controlling the clicker? I only have a couple slides, so. Awesome. So I'm a sociologist, and I study how people make a living and how they feel about it. This has included people working for pay, people relying on social assistance, EI, people relying on informal under-the-table work, retired people, people at the highest and lowest income levels. And across all of the research that I've done, whether I'm interviewing homeless teenagers, contract instructors, photographers, farmers, lawyers, what I've found is that while people do care about the amount of money they have or the amount of income they earn, they care as much, if not more, about the predictability and the stability of their income. So in other words, people can make extremely high incomes, but feel insecure because they don't know if they'll make any money next month or next year. On the other hand, people can have quite low incomes but be okay because they're predictable and stable and likely to continue into the future. And I should add, they don't have to line up and apply for them every year. People who have to hustle, whether that means chasing freelance contracts, reapplying for their own job every few months, begging for hours from a part-time employer, or dealing with a caseworker to receive social assistance every few weeks, people who have to engage in that kind of hustle face a unique type of stress, and that's the stress of insecurity, the stress of never quite knowing. So when people's incomes vary substantially from one week to the next, or 1 month to the next, there's a psychological unease and a practical difficulty that you don't necessarily see with low income alone. It's hard to think very far into the future when your income is a question mark. These consequences of economic insecurity are both psychologically and socially damaging. Research from Ontario's Rust Belt, where a decaying auto industry gave way to more precarious service-based work, has shown that people who face economic insecurity, not just low income but unpredictable incomes, are more likely to have mental health problems, and they are less likely to have friends that they can talk to. They're less likely to be involved in their communities, their kids are less likely to be in extracurriculars, they're less likely to have hobbies compared to people who are in more secure employment with more secure incomes. Because when employers can't commit to people by way of long-term contracts and predictable schedules, people can't commit to the world. When governments can't commit to people by way of consistent, adequate social assistance rates, people can't commit to the world. These are the findings in my academic life that led me to advocate for a basic income in my personal life, because one of the main features of a basic income, the model that Big NS espouses, is that it's a consistent, predictable minimum income guarantee with very minimal eligibility requirements. So the basic income guarantee that we advocate wouldn't require a person to apply for or prove they deserve a basic income every month. The amounts wouldn't depend on showing your receipts to a caseworker or promising that you're going to spend it on the right stuff. It eliminates the insecurity and the hustle and most of their attendant indignities. These problems and the solution that BIG represents matter a great deal in rural Canada for a few reasons. The first is that rural households are likely to face some entrenched kinds of insecurity that don't affect urban households as much. As you could probably guess, rural jobs are more likely to be seasonal than urban jobs. So these are jobs in primary industry, jobs in tourism. Rural households are more likely to draw income from multiple sources, including informal economy sources such as yard sales or jobs that are done under the table. Rural Canada actually has a higher rate of self-employment than urban Canada, and it's largely the precarious form of self-employment where you don't have employees. These three characteristics indicate a different kind of insecurity in rural households, not so much the precarious work that we consider a new development, so temp agency jobs and gig economy work, but older entrenched ways of making a living that are nevertheless insecure and unpredictable and have been for over 100 years. But rural communities also face the same challenges as urban communities to differing degrees. There's straight up poverty in rural places. Employment incomes are lower. Even the amounts that are drawn from social assistance are lower, as is the incidence of social assistance use. EI usage is higher in rural communities, and not only because of the dominance of fishing and farming. A large proportion of the EI use in rural areas is actually first-time claimants, so not the repeat claimants that we probably picture. There are also qualitative differences in the experience and expression of poverty in rural areas. It's more likely to be hidden. Even homelessness is hidden. There are fewer and, in many cases, no services for homeless people in rural communities. And this happens to the point that homeless young people often migrate to cities from rural communities to become officially homeless, to take advantage of services. So all of this is to say that rural poverty might be a more isolating experience. For these reasons, I see basic income as an obvious and elegant policy solution to the complex problem of poverty and insecurity. Its advantage over the current mix of social assistance, disability, and other income transfers beyond the ones that we've already talked about today is that it would be, I think, less likely to have an urban bias built into it because it just wouldn't have as many eligibility requirements and rules attached to it. And I can get into that more in the discussion. The only other slide I had was just to show you the seasonal month-to-month variation in employment in rural versus urban Canada. So the really crazy line is in rural communities and the tamer-looking blue line is in urban communities. So you can see there's a lot more churn in employment, people who would really benefit from a smoothing out of incomes. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. Our fifth panelist this afternoon is Wallace Nevin, and I don't actually have a bio to introduce for you, Wallace. So I had the pleasure of meeting Wallace yesterday at dinner, and what I do know about Wallace is that he is an extremely dedicated human rights activist. So for a man without introduction, here's Wallace.
Hi. Well, I'm here because I believe the Mi'kmaq need a basic income. And the reasons why, this doesn't seem to be working. Do you hear me? Okay. Perpetual wardship for our people has never worked, right? For our people, it's always been about inadequate funding. You know, I'd like to speak a lot longer than what we got here, but I'll try to wrap it up in a short period of time. In 1960, believe it or not, social assistance was introduced to the Aboriginal people of Canada. In Nova Scotia, before 1960, we were given food vouchers. I guess the Indian agency didn't trust us with money. So what they did was gave us food vouchers to the local store, which they ran. This worked for a while. At least we didn't have to get the passes to go off reserves because centralization occurred in 42 and they couldn't write enough passes for the two communities they developed. Every other community across Canada had to get passes to leave the reserves. Now, we'll switch ahead. In 1987, like everyone else in Nova Scotia, we had an increase for social assistance. Something peculiar happened in the 1990s. Uncontrolled deficits took over. Indian Affairs stepped in, being a primary trustee. They said to the chiefs and councils, you must reduce your spending. Reduce all monies, including social assistance. So the average Mi'kmaq recipient was receiving $370 a month. It was reduced by 12.5%, and that was probably 30 years ago. And that's quite a bit for someone 12.5% income, especially over a 30-year period. What happened was, as time went on, jobs, honorariums increased by maybe 500%, right? That's not including the salaries that Indigenous Affairs received over that 30-year period of time. Yet, I believe that Indigenous Affairs, Indian Affairs, Aboriginal Affairs, or whatever we want to call them, the practice of not increasing social assistance for the very poor was based on economic racism. You know, how could they not see that they had never given the poor people a raise in their social assistance? It's just amazing. I'm not sure what to say. What more to say? Is that we just got total inadequate funding. And our only recourse is for our people to get a basic income, which would increase monies to everyone within our community. But the other thing about it is, this is like Senator Hugh Segal said, this money is not coming from the taxes of the people in Canada. It comes from a different resource. It's coming from the resource accumulated by the country of Canada, harvesting all the resource that is owned by the Indigenous people of this country, you know? And we have no champions. There's never, ever been someone from AFN, which is the Assembly of First Nations, CAP, which is Canada's Aboriginal people, the provincial and territorial organizations. They've never, ever mentioned an increase for the poor. They talk about economic development schemes, they talk about treaty rights, they talk about trade, they talk about business, but they've never talked about the fundamental issue of how to address the poor people. They've never brought that up. Not once. You can check. You know, you can stop me anytime. But I feel so bad because I'm looking, how can we justify a 12.5% decrease because of Indian Affairs' inadequate funding scheme, and how can they justify not giving them an increase over 30 years? That's what I can't get over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wallace. Our next panelist is Wayne McNaughton. Wayne is a Halifax poverty activist who approaches solutions to poverty using a human rights lens. Though he has worked on issues such as food security and housing and homelessness, he was the only chair of a federally sanctioned community advisory board to have ever been homeless. He has mostly worked on poverty overall, being a member of groups at a local level, the Community Advocates Network, Basic Income Nova Scotia, and the national level, Canada Without Poverty, and international level, ATD Fourth World Movement. Wayne was an income assistance recipient until turning 65 changed his life by providing an income above the poverty line. Please welcome Wayne.
Thank you. I should mention, I'll start off just with a brief little, I guess kind of an update. For those of you who've been to our previous conferences, at the conference that took place here in this room 3 years ago, I spoke about how I was looking forward to turning 65 because I would graduate out of income assistance and into Canada's pension system and what that would mean. And I said I was really looking forward to that. Well, here's an update, just so you know, for those of you that heard those remarks at that time. That was 3 years ago. 1 year ago, as was just mentioned, I became 65. I stopped receiving income assistance. Don't really miss that. Especially, I don't miss the red tape and bureaucracy that it took to get that. I swear to heavens, it's like basically they would call me in and ask me for receipts for my rent. They were paying the rent directly to the landlord, and they'd ask me for receipts for my rent. You know, it's like that kind of bureaucracy nonsense that it just drives people crazy. Anyway, I don't have to deal with that anymore. As of yesterday, I received my 12th old age security guaranteed income supplement payment. It's quite a difference. I've been receiving Canada Pension Plan retirement benefit for about 3.5 years. In fact, income assistance, the community services people insisted I had to apply for that because once I started receiving that, they were able to deduct it dollar for dollar from my income assistance check. So I didn't get more money. And as people may know, CPP is indexed. It goes up every year. And each increase in CPP was taxed back by income assistance to the penny. So I didn't see any increase because we haven't had any increases in income assistance in the last several years. Well, sorry, we've had one. Yeah, okay. Anyway, so now I'm in receipt of what really is a basic income. I saw an increase in my income of well over 60%. Once I turned 65. And to put a bit more perspective on that, some of the changes that were made as part of their transformation process means that I actually got an increase of 70% because my income assistance would have gone down if I'd still been on income assistance by $78 a month or more. Because that's what's sort of the trade. They say, we're giving you people more, no, they're really not. It's a lot of smoke and mirrors with community services. Anyway, so I'm doing a lot better. The biggest change is just the idea of the stability of the income. The income, I know how much I'm going to be getting every month. I can count on it. I can count on it being indexed to the rate of inflation at least, maybe even increased a little more if the politicians in Ottawa decide they want to give seniors a little more so they can get reelected. Who knows? They actually do that. I don't know why the province can't catch on to that idea. Anyway. So it's like I'm able to go out and make reasonable purchases of things that I need. I'm able to buy the food that I want without worrying about pinching every penny twice. I'm able to actually take advantage of bargains at the supermarket. You walk into Sobeys or Superstore. I use mostly Sobeys because it's the most convenient. And they'll offer this thing of, you buy X amount and you can get extra air miles. Okay, but in order to get the extra air miles, you have to buy a certain amount. Well, what happens when you don't have enough to take advantage of that? You can't. So you lose out on those extra air miles. You lose out on the money that saves you. When something goes on sale at a lower price for a limited time, usually just for a week, you can't go out and stock up on it because you've got just enough to get what you need for the next couple of weeks. You don't have enough to stock up on what's there. Having money actually saves you money. Guess what? Being poor costs money. It costs you more to be poor. And it's really a wonderful feeling to be able to go to the supermarket and get what I need and go out and buy real things that I need for my home and for my comfort, that I would have to, literally, about 3 years ago, I got a new computer. I had to put a GoFundMe campaign up to be able to buy a new computer. Well, guess what? I just finished buying another new computer a couple of days ago, and I was able to pay for it out of my own savings because I have savings every month now. That's the kind of difference it makes, having a guaranteed income as opposed to a bare subsistence income assistance. I just want to make a couple other points about some of the stuff that's been mentioned earlier about, there's two things about basic income that cause people to pause. One of them is the idea, the fear, the very legitimate fear, I guess, about, okay, I'm engaged in social services. I'm working for the government or I'm working for a nonprofit agency. I'm helping people living in poverty. If there's no more people living in poverty, what am I going to do? I'm going to lose my job. And there's people that actually have that fear, and I can understand it. The unions that represent them have that fear. Well, guess what? Poverty causes an awful lot of damage. An awful lot of damage. There's people that have been living in poverty for not just for years, for generations. If you think there's not going to be any more work for those people that want to help the poor, once poverty has been eliminated, guess what? You're wrong. Just look at the example of what's happened when we've closed down long-term institutions like the residential schools or the schools for the deaf and the blind and things like that. People need help for the rest of their lives to deal with the damage that was done to them while they were in those places. And the same thing goes for poverty. People are going to need help for the rest of their lives to deal with the damage that's been done to them. So that's, don't worry about your job. You're going to still have a job. I like what Evelyn Forget said, that she doesn't even think that what we should be thinking about is those social services workers will immediately be reassigned to other tasks, and I agree with that. Here's another thing too with the disability issue. Instead of having a DCS worker who knows nothing about your disabilities, who has no medical training for the most of the time, dealing with whether you need a new wheelchair or whether you need this apparatus or whether you need this other special need, what would happen if people were said, okay, you need that? Great, go see rehabilitative services at the QE2. They'll decide how much they can give you to help you with that. Someone who's qualified, someone who's an occupational therapist, who's a medical social worker would look at you and say, okay, here's what we're able to give you to help with that, instead of having to deal with the DCS bureaucracy. I think that would be a big improvement. And the final thing I'm just going to say is that we do have we do have to be vigilant. We are likely to see some kind of a basic income in the coming years. It's very possible because it is the most easiest, most simple answer for governments throughout the Western world trying to deal with a rapidly changing economy, with rapidly growing artificial intelligence-driven automation that's like no other automation that we've ever seen. It's going to throw millions of people out of work. They're going to need to have an answer for that, and they may resort to basic income. But we have to be really vigilant to make sure that we get the basic income we want. The basic income that still goes hand in hand with important social programs like universal health care, universal education, and so on. Not the basic income of Milton Friedman in the United States, who proposed basic income to replace government social programs. Here, we'll give you a check, you go out and buy those programs on the private market and you'll be a lot better off. No, we don't want that. So we're going to have to be vigilant to make sure that we get the basic income we want. We keep demanding just that. There's my thoughts.
Thanks, Wayne. Our final panelist with us this afternoon is Jennifer Brady. Jennifer Brady is an assistant professor in applied human nutrition at Mount St. Vincent University. Her work focuses on health, food, health, and social justice from an interdisciplinary perspective. Please welcome Jennifer. Thank you. Am I in control? Okay. Can you throw my slides up?
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Sorry. My fault.
It's easier to follow with the visual. As they're throwing that up, I'll just maybe introduce what I'm going to talk about by saying I wanted to make a couple quick points off the bat that will essentially reiterate or underscore what we've already heard about today around food insecurity. Kathy Ma spoke quite a bit about that earlier today. So usually, and this is really what Kathy was addressing, is household and individual food insecurity. And this tends to be what people think of off the bat when you hear the words food insecurity or food bank use. It's essentially the income-related or financial barriers to accessing a sufficient quantity or quality of food. So I want to show you a little data very quickly about that, and very quickly because we've already heard Kathy Ma talk about it. But I want to talk about aspects of food insecurity that step beyond just the quantity and quality of food, just the basic caloric quantity, because there's so many aspects of food that are so important to our lives that are often seen as something beyond or something as aspirational, something that would be nice to have but not necessary to have. And what I want to argue, or what I want to say for my 2 cents, is that they're not extra. The pleasure, the joy, the social, the community are not extra beyond quantity. So, surprise, food insecurity is income related. That's essentially the take home of this. This breaks down what that looks like in terms of Canada-wide data, the actual prevalence of food insecurity across the income gradient in this country. I should just say, obviously the depth increases as well. So the prevalence and the depth both increase. Again, not surprising, diagnoses of acute and chronic health issues increase with increasing food insecurity. So for those who are food insecure, they tend to be sicker, they tend to have shorter life expectancies, and you see that increase or worsen with worsening depths of food insecurity. Not another surprise, so that was physical health conditions. That's also true for mental health conditions. And of course, Evelyn Forget talked quite a bit about mental health earlier. So connecting these dots, I think, is something that we regularly do when we talk about food insecurity. But like I said, I want to just take it a little bit beyond the physical and mental health issues that we see with food insecurity to talk about the other aspects of loss that we experience as individuals, as households, but also as in our communities
and across the province. So first off, when people are unable to choose the food that they eat, and the ways that they access it, there's a loss of dignity. And I could talk on about these topics. But I'll highlight just a couple aspects to illustrate what I mean when I say a loss of dignity. Visiting the food bank, there's shame and stigma galore attached to having to visit a food bank. For Indigenous people in the province, not being able to access food in ways, and this is partly in relation to treaty, but it's also partly related to income and having an ability to buy supplies for hunting, for example. Hunting is not inexpensive. So there's a loss of dignity when people aren't able to exercise their cultural, social food practices, or what we consider normal, a normal food experience, on what we value around that. I mentioned this a little bit already, but the loss of social, cultural, and spiritual food practices is also vital to our physical and mental health. So social support networks is a social determinant of health. And one of the ways that we garner those social support networks is through sharing food and through sharing community through food practices. So this is going to be particularly salient, again, for Indigenous folks in Nova Scotia, across the world. But if you're Jewish, if you eat a halal diet, that's not extra to the quantity of food that you need every day. That is also a vital part of eating. The other aspect of food security, which is very important, which usually isn't what we first think about, is what's called community food security. So this is at a level beyond the individual or the household. And so like individual and household food security, there's lots of different definitions, and this is one of them. But community food security addresses the security of our food system, the ability or the security of our communities to know that at a community level, we will be able to provide our communities, our province, with food. And so I'm going to address that for just the 2 minutes I have remaining. So with the loss of human potential that we experience because of the detriment to physical and mental health, as well as just the ability to participate in the world, in the economy, or just in everyday life in the province, the loss of human potential means that we as a community collectively experience a loss of folks who could otherwise be doing activities like farming, like agricultural practices, growing food, or growing our security as communities and access to food. Certainly in Nova Scotia, but across Canada, there's been a decline in the number of farms and the problem of people being able to access farming as well is a huge problem. So with basic income guarantee, it allows people to enter the labor force through entrepreneurial activities such as farming, such as being able to buy farms or create food businesses, as an example. The other impact of poverty is one of the ways as a society that we've sought to address the problem of food security as it's caused by poverty is by decreasing the cost of food. So our ever widening pursuit for cheap food actually costs us a lot as a society. It has weakened the security of our food systems. It also is one of the biggest drivers of the climate impact of the food system that we have. So as we try to address food insecurity, not just by food banks, but also by decreasing the cost of food, producing it more cheaply, we see the widespread environmental degradation because of that drive to produce food cheaply and usually less healthfully as well. So all of that, and there's certainly more detail to pull out in that, but at a high level, poverty costs us at an individual and household level in food insecurity, but also at a community level, and this is only going to worsen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jennifer. So that concludes the first portion of the panel, and we'll be moving on to the question and answer portion. So for this portion, anyone in the audience can ask a question to a specific panelist or to, in general, to the group. And we have 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. My name is Daniela Kempkens. I come at this topic from a public health and preventive medicine background. Thank you to all the panelists and the organizers of the day. I think it was very stimulating with lots of different perspectives being brought in. I have to admit, I'm being left a little unsettled or with big questions on how to go from here. I think the evidence is loud and clear. We don't need to examine it more. The benefits in all kinds of different aspects of our social lives are clear as well. But how do we move this forward on the political agenda? Because we won't get anywhere without having the politicians behind this idea. And yeah, so the question to all the panelists is, what are your ideas on how to actually move this forward so it can become reality in Nova Scotia and across Canada? Thank you.
One suggestion, we're in an election year. Okay? There's a federal election coming up in less than 6 months' time. Make it an issue. That would be my suggestion. Make it an issue. There are a couple of political parties that sort of dance around and seem to be interested. We need to have all the political parties interested. Thank you.
One thing I'd say to that is, in addition to what Wayne said, is, none of us have to reinvent the wheel. There's so many groups already organizing around these issues. Food Banks Canada, actually one of their recommendations to solve food insecurity, and this is Food Banks Canada, this is the corporation that runs food banks across Canada, is a basic income guarantee. So there's Nourish Nova Scotia that's working from a food security perspective. There's so many groups, us, Basic Income Nova Scotia. So join, I would say lend your voice to the organizing that's already happening.
If I may add, I would think that one of the ways of doing it would be asking to all our politicians, be at the federal level, provincial level, why don't you want to respect the dignity of the human being, number one? And what drives you to consider that person's worth is less than yours, or their merit as a human being is less, or their dignity? What makes you somehow feel as if you are there and we're nobodies? What makes you? Is it necessary to shame? Well, yes. It's been around. I mean, the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous, the United Nations Declaration of Rights since 1948. It's not new. It's there. The preambular clause, freedom from want. We, even in Canada specifically, left that out of our Constitution in 1982. It wasn't that we didn't know about it. Politicians, the 10 premiers, including the Prime Minister, who did something interesting, though, create a constitutional democracy, left it out purposely. Why? Because I truly believe there's this class system. You have or you don't have. And we have to just put it right to them. Thank you.
If I may, Danielle, I agree with you, where do we go from here? But I also think we have to keep in mind, where did we come from? And 5 years ago, I think basic income was something that was, all over the place. And I think it is coalescing into something that is very clear to what people want and so on. I also think it needs a broader base. And, for instance, when I said, say if we look at the benefits of a basic income, I really think, we heard about the idea of community in rural areas and all those kind of things. I really think we need people like faith groups, community-oriented people, cultural groups and so on, have to start embracing this idea that this is good for them. It's not just good for raising people out of poverty, but it's good for them, because it creates community. And hopefully that's where we can go and push it forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Pierre. I think we have another question.
Hi, my question's for Karen Foster. You were talking earlier about how people make a living, and I'm intrigued by the idea of fulfillment. And there was a recent article, a series of articles that were posted on the ECMA for musicians about where it was about mental health, but putting that aside as a cause and effect, it revealed to me that independent musicians, as an example, make on average about $10,000 a year. I'm wondering if you could talk just a minute about what you're hearing from this group and groups like that in terms of, are they aware of, or to you in your research, do they seem to be aware of or talking about the possibility of a basic income being a way for them to to express their creative energies without having to say, take another job or go to food banks or do whatever? Could you expand on that for me?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that it's that it comes up specifically a lot in any of the research that I've done, but in very general terms, I would say that that if people didn't have to worry about making ends meet, they would make a lot of different choices about what they do for a living. And there are a lot of jobs that we really do that matter to us a whole heck of a lot, music being one of them. Like, find a person in this room who hasn't listened to music in the last 48 hours. But we tend to value those economically very little. So there's an anthropologist called David Graeber who has this term bullshit jobs, and he notes that a lot of the jobs that pay the most are jobs that could literally disappear tonight, and we'd wake up and not notice, like PR managers, for example, and most of us wouldn't notice. But if, say, garbage collectors who don't get paid as much were to disappear, daycare workers, we would notice those things. So what we value as a society in kind of general terms and what we value economically is often very out of sync. And I think that sort of speaks to what you're talking about. Being a musician is real work. We value the products. And so a basic income could be a way to say, well, the market is never going to solve this problem for us. People are used to paying, cents or nothing at all for songs. But if we had a basic income, then we wouldn't have to be so dependent on market mechanisms to make it so that people can feed themselves and that kind of thing. So that's sort of get at it. I would say I don't see as much. I see a lot of appetite for a basic income and general interest, but not a whole lot of organizing or toward it.
Thank you. I'd say that does answer my question. But I say it's the musician example is speaks to my greater point that you touch on with fulfillment, because I see a lot of young people coming up, going to school in the classroom setting, which is all good and fine, and then coming out without that security that you spoke of, that knowing that they're going to get paid, knowing that they're going to meet their basic needs, and then really having to struggle to make it to some next level that they don't know if they're going to make it to or not, and then not know the whole way through if they're going to end up doing something they even want to do. So that's why today, and I think you actually asked this in a question as well, is that I see I'm hearing a lot of great things about why we need it, but I'm thinking is that this is a target audience that hasn't really come up here, is that people that do have a chance to be above, say, the poverty line at some point, but not necessarily not doing what they want to do or something that they're even interested in doing. And I think that I'm just saying is I just want to throw out a point to the panel that basic income is for a lot more than low income or poverty. And like a lot of my clients, for instance, like, who are in the, creative economy, for instance, don't have that stability because they got to wait till their next show, or they got to wait till their next, opportunity, or or they're getting paid 0.0056 cents a song play, or they're looking for YouTube revenue, but they have a parochial audience.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying it's intriguing to know that the research you're doing is on how people feel about the kind of work that they do, and I just think basic income is the answer.
Yeah, and if I can just add a tiny little point, because I know we're short on time, but there's lots of evidence that's sort of related that shows that if people have a basic income, they'll take a risk and start a business. They'll do something entrepreneurial. So the same sort of leap is in creative industries as well, right?
Thank you. We have a question up at the back.
Hi, how you guys doing?
Great.
Good. I'm Fergus Dearden. I was United Nations Associations of Canada's and British Council's Most Promising Young Innovator for last year at the Youth Innovation Summit. I'm held on Parliament Hill. I just happened to pop in here and see the sign and got me curious. So anyway, kind of like two questions. The first is, have you ever heard of La Satellite de la Vie? It was invented by a French economist. No? La Satellite de la Vie? So basically, the whole theory is that it turns every single corporation into a co-op. And what happens is it takes the wages out of the hands of corporations and puts it into government. So like this, it's almost like an expansion of basic income. So every single person would get a base amount every single month, but it would be based on your education. And the more education you got, the more money you got from the government. And that would you would also get more money on top of that if you worked. So let's say you worked 5 years. In addition to whatever education you had, you would get a base amount that the government would predetermine based on your education, plus additional monies based on how many years you worked. So that might be something to kind of add to your repertoire. I can't remember the economist's name. I wish I could, but it's definitely there somewhere on the internet. I saw it a couple years ago. So the second thing is, have you ever heard of the Venus Project? No? Yeah? Somebody in here has heard of it? Yeah. So basically, it's an organization down in Florida, and it's about a resource-based economy. So this economy is based off of no money, no trade, no nothing. And they're actually in the phases right now of building a research center. So the whole idea is that everything's automated. Everybody has their needs met. So if you kind of want to find out more about that, it's thevenusproject.com. So.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you. I had a different question, but what he just said just reminded me of something. Libya, before Gaddafi was removed by Canadian government and a few other people, actually guaranteed income to all their citizens.
Could you put the microphone closer?
Sure.
Thank you.
The government of Libya guaranteed income to all their citizens up to when Canadian government arranged to have them killed. So I think it's important to understand that these things have happened successfully in places that had less resources than Canada. Mm-hmm. So there's fundamentally no excuse for not doing it, so I think we can avoid it. As I was listening to the discussion, I just came from a community discussion around street checks. And they were talking about how the process of actually unfairly giving Black and Indigenous people criminal records by their interaction with the police negatively affects the chances of having employment, which leads to poverty, which then leads to food insecurity. So there's this direct sort of a connection in how colonial governments function by depriving people. And then we have prisons that are making all kinds of profits. So there seems like there's an incentive in the system to imprison more and more people. And so we need to sort of think about that. So I was wondering what your reflections were, anyone, on the connections between, we talked about class, but also how race and the colonial mindset in the needing to extract resources under capitalism in order to make people rich. And it doesn't seem like we talk about capitalism enough, or if we do in the media, it seems to be as if capitalism and so-called democracy is gonna save everything when it's actually at the root of the destruction that we're experiencing collectively.
Thank
I don't
you.
even know if that was the question per se.
Karen?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to point out that what basic income kind of tries to confront are interconnected systems of capitalism and patriarchy and colonialism. What draws me to a basic income as an advocate is that it severs the connection between income and employment. And in doing so, it frees people to make choices. And it also, I guess, severs the connection between unemployment and poverty. So it opens doors for people that otherwise would be closed, and it challenges capitalism as a total system without starting at capitalism. It doesn't say we need to be a different kind of society. It says we need to just guarantee people an income apart from work and see what happens. And I think it would enable a lot of people to say no to some really terrible working conditions.
So I want to, I'm afraid I'm going to have to draw this set of presentations to a close. I want to thank you all for stimulating presentations and different perspectives on a basic income and the impact of a basic income and why we need to move forward. Thank you all to the audience for coming for this prolonged discussion and for your wonderful questions and comments throughout. I have cards for all of you, so I'm going to walk down the line giving them to you. But I want to say just a couple of things before you leave. One of them is that with permission from the presenters, recorded presentations will be put on our Facebook page, as well as PowerPoint presentations. So I know people have been asking about being able to access these presentations again, and we have somebody who has been recording the whole conference as well. The McNaughton Institute has been recording this panel and will be video recording this panel and will be uploading that to their website, and so that will also be available, and we will certainly distribute a link. So there is access to these to this information beyond today.